really am honored and would love to introduce Professor Eric Bradlow and invite him to talk about his research and talking about the real value of brand equity. Eric?
Thank you very much, Katrina. And it's great to be back with Teradata for the 6th year. This research is very personal to me for a number of reasons. First, whenever we as academics do research, we'd love to find out, if you'd like, to pressure test it to see if there's actually real world value of it. And it's not just me as an academic saying this. For those people that know, I'm also a business owner. I'm a co-founder of a marketing research and insights company, and we do brand equity research all the time. And the problem is, and this is what motivated this research, it was really motivated a few years ago. The problem is the way, I hate to put this personally to our hundreds of participants, but the way all of you do it is wrong. And so I have to fix that wrong today. And the reason it's wrong, and you can kind of see in my hopefully evocative title, is that the way most people think about brand equity is way too narrow. It's much more than you think it is. But even differently, the way most people measure brand equity today is through what's called a brand tracker. So you do maybe every month or every quarter, you do a survey, you ask people perceptions of your brand, you track that over time. And by the way, I hope the takeaway from this talk is not to abandon brand trackers. That is not the purpose of this talk. However, everything I'm going to show you in this talk, up until the last slide, is based purely on the transactional data that you have. So if you'd like, a second title to this talk might be not just the real value of brand equity, it's more than you think, it's transaction-based brand equity. So all the research I'm about to show you, you don't have to go out and collect new data, it's actually from the purchase transaction data that all of you have. So let me get started. I'm going to first go to my favorite source for anything, which is Wikipedia. And while I'm not going to read all of this, Wikipedia has a nice definition of brand equity, but let me highlight a few things in Wikipedia's definition. The first, it has to do with brand recognition. So stronger brands are recognized more. As a matter of fact, how many times have we all been shown the Apple picture? We're like, it doesn't even say Apple, it's just a picture, and we recognize the brand. The Nike swoosh is another example. There are many brands around the world where we recognize them just from their mark. The second is better than. So if Bradlow introduces a product, this is not a known brand, except in academia maybe, and Nike introduces a product, well, all else equal, whose product are people going to think is better? Well, they're going to think the Nike product because it has a known brand. And that's why you can see both better than and product quality. And the last part is price premiums, which is all else equal, who gets to charge a price premium? Well, the company with the larger brand. Now, this is a nice definition, and I agree with this definition. But here's the problem. The mathematical models, the way most people operationalize brand equity today, doesn't take any of this into account. And here, let me be very precise. So what's the problem? Well, the way we as academics think about brand equity or about any product choice that customers make is what's called product utility. In other words, why do people buy products? People get utility from products, and if the utility someone gets is greater than the price that you would charge them, someone buys the product or service. Here's the problem, and by the way, as a professor and as a quant professor, I have to give you at least a few equations, but these are evocative, intuitive equations. Here's the idea. Let's say you have a product, let's call it J. A given time period, let's say monthly, you have product J at time T. The most ways that people define brand equity is what's called the intercept, or let me use the English language version. Once I control for how important all the features are, and once I control for the value of the attributes, after taking all of those things into account, the intercept, what's left over, is brand equity. In other words, if you go to an academic conference, if you look at the way most people think, matter of fact, if you go to accounting, the field of accounting, how do they put equity on the balance sheet? After all the tangible assets of the firm are accounted for, what's left over is brand equity. Well, that's kind of the way marketers define it. X, which are the features of your product or service, after those features, X, with importance weights, beta, are accounted for. What's left over is brand equity. And notice, by the way, this will be on the next few slides. Blue is for the intercept, red is for the slopes, and green is for the product attributes. Or again, as I said in summary, after controlling for X, what is left over is brand equity. And again, just to motivate this research again, I was sitting in an academic conference 3 years ago and I heard this and my head was ready to explode. I was like, there's no way this can be actually what people do. And then I went back and read the academic literature, and that is what people do. And it's this equation that I do not agree with, and I'm going to convince you in the next couple minutes. So all of that is wrong. Now, why? Let me give you an example. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Let's take Starbucks, which is obviously one of the great brands of the world. So first, do you really believe that brand equity is constant? Well, of course not. You know, positive things happen to Starbucks in the news, negative things happen. They spend money on marketing. Brand equity goes up and down over time. And so you remember in the previous equation, I had intercept having a subscript J. That means it's constant. There's no subscript T. Therefore, you agree with me that this idea that there's brand equity, no, there's not brand equity. There's time-varying brand equity. So it should be JT, brand J at time T. I call this the dynamic brand equity effect. Let's go to a second example. Let's imagine the Bradlow unnamed cup on the left, Starbucks on the right. We both charge a given price for a product. Remember, beta for red is the price coefficient. Well, which of these two brands do you think people will be more price elastic for? Well, probably the Bradlow brand. The Bradlow brand increases the price. It's going to have a much greater negative effect than if Starbucks does. So you therefore disagree with the premise that beta, the importance of price, is brand specific. No, is constant. It should be brand specific. In other words, it should have a subscript J. Some brands have different price coefficients, different advertising effectiveness coefficients than others. And I call this the brand equity coefficient effect, meaning the stronger your brand, let's take price, the less price elastic people will be. As a matter of fact, I hope everyone listening says, yeah, that's why I invest in my brand. I want to be able to charge a price premium. And the way to do that is to build your brand. The third example, do you think if Starbucks and Bradlow, now I'm green for quality, have the same objective quality, that they'll be perceived the same? Well, I think we all agree that's not true. So in other words, X shouldn't just be J and T. There should be a subscript K, which is depending on which brand it is, the actual just perceived quality of the brand may be different. Okay, and I call this the brand equity X effect. So let me summarize, and then I see that there's a question in the chat, which I'll get to. So the old model, I'm just repeating the model I had from 3 slides ago, has that utility has a constant brand equity effect plus a slope times X, which are the features. And I'm just saying, no, you need to think about it a little bit more broadly. The intercept has to change with time. The betas have to be brand specific. And I've noticed I have X in green in the upper equation and X prime in green, which is the perceived value of the attribute of the brand itself. And the other part, and this is the most important part for those listening here, dynamic brand equity, and this is what I hope to talk to Martin about after my talk is done. Dynamic brand equity, it's not something you as a firm just passively look at and say, well, I hope it's high today. No, you do marketing to change the brand equity of your firm. And so not only should the intercept be time varying, but as I'll show you next, you, the firm, have something to say about the value of brand equity. Okay? So just to remind you, and just to expand on that concept, it's what we in marketing call the common filter equation, and it's a very simple idea. Is that, notice on the left-hand side of this equation, I have time t, the brand equity at time t. On the right-hand side, I have the brand equity at time t minus 1. And the difference, lambda, is how much carries over from one period to the next. And this is called the brand-specific carryover coefficient. For example, if lambda is 1, then whatever brand equity you invest in stays forever. If lambda is 0, whatever brand equity you have disappears immediately from one period to the next. But here's the key part. This is the past equity. This is the amount of marketing that you spend in the current period. This is also sometimes called, it's one of my favorite analogies, the leaky bucket hypothesis. Water, think of water being your brand equity in a bucket. Lambda is the rate at which water stays in the bucket. 1 minus lambda is the rate at which water comes out of the bucket. When you spend money on marketing, more water goes into the bucket. So marketing pours water into the bucket. Lambda takes water out of the bucket. And this is what you're trying to maximize. So again, the idea here for the firm is that if you can invest in marketing and you can raise your intercept, then that's going to increase your brand equity and your sales over time. Just a few questions I see. We constantly check. I see a question here about NPS scores. We take that into account. Use of NPS scores is important. What's actually interesting about NPS scores, I'm a big fan of NPS scores, except as a health metric, except there's no research that shows that I've seen that NPS scores are actually predictive of market share and sales. But we can talk about that offline. I'm happy to. It's an interesting question. Another question, what about brands like Walmart that always offer low prices? Now, what's interesting there is why are they offering low price? And so they might be offering low price to bring lots of people into the store. But if you're asking, could price, like in this perfect question for this slide, like I have marketing here on this slide. People have studied this. Maybe price should affect your brand equity. Firms that offer low price, well, on the one hand, you might sell more of the product. On the other hand, you might damage your brand. And this is actually one of the questions I'm going to talk to Martin about further on. So thanks for your questions, and please keep them coming. Okay, so just to summarize, the old model assumes static equity. Starbucks has a certain equity and it just stays there. It assumes price coefficients aren't brand specific and not driven by brand equity. I hope I've convinced you that's a ridiculous assumption. If a known brand and an unknown brand both change price, the price elasticity of demand is going to be much different between those brands. It assumes the same quality, all else equal. I think we know that's probably not true. And also, in current models, marketing plays a passive role. The intercept is what it is. Well, no, it isn't what it is. You can do something about is what it is. And so in the new model, firms invest in marketing to affect brand equity, and it has this universal effect, not just on the intercept, but on the price elasticity and on the product perceptions. Brand equity carries over. So the amount you spend today affects your equity in the future, which is what every firm wants. And again, thus there are short-term effects of brand equity and also long-term effects of brand equity. Okay, so now we get to the part that you're all waiting for. Why do we care? Well, it's very simple. Marketing can drive brand equity, and brand equity can drive preference. Then a firm can decide how much to optimally invest its resources depending on the value of its brand equity. And this is the big part, and I'll show you this through an empirical example in my last few minutes, is that if you think brand equity is constant, or you think brand equity is only affecting the intercept, all else equal, what's left, you're ignoring the price elasticity effect, the perception effect, which will mean you will underestimate brand equity. You will underestimate the effect of brand equity. You will spend less marketing, and therefore you will build less brand equity because you're underestimating its actual value. Okay? So let me go directly now to my empirical example. Okay, so this is an example of a data set. It's a scanner panel data set. This is what we in academics use all the time. So we all go to grocery stores and our products are scanned. This is a sample of 1,800 customers, 3 years of data. One of my favorite product categories, pretzels. I'll talk about some research we're doing with other product categories later on. It's about 180,000 observations, and we have data on purchases, marketing expenditure, and prices. And I have two models here. There's really three models, but I'm only going to show you two. Model one is the original model I told you about, where equity is static. Model three is the glorified Bradlow model, which has all the different marketing effects in it that I talked about. Okay, and just to show you, here's the picture of the weekly optimal prices. For Rolled Gold, which is one of the major brands, you can see here, whether it's model 1 or 3, there's not that much of an effect. But for Snyder's, who's the second player, the smaller of the two brands in this industry, there's a huge effect. In model 3, which is the model with dynamic brand equity, which is my model, it suggests that Snyder's should drop its price to generate greater sales, greater brand equity, and longer run profits. Okay, and just to show you a picture, you can also see here we have profit on the y-axis. Remember, there's 3 years of data on the x-axis. This is out of sample forecasting of profits for each of the two brands. Rolled Gold, by the way, doesn't particularly have dynamic brand equity, so it doesn't really matter. Notice Snyder's, notice the black curve is above the black inverted U-shaped curve, is above the gray inverted U-shaped curve, which means in my model, Snyder's makes more money because it invests more money in brand equity, and actually because its brand equity is higher, it actually can spend less money on advertising. And remember, I just want to remind everybody, this is out of sample prediction. So we basically fit our mathematical model and do a hypothetical, what would happen if Rolled Gold and Snyder's spent different amounts of money on advertising. The other feature I want to talk about, which is kind of interesting here, is we also considered, I'm sure we've all heard of these ideas of pulsing, like when should you spend money on advertising? Should you heavy up on advertising? So we considered here 3 different strategies. One we call the concentrated strategy, which means imagine Rolled Gold and Snyder's at the beginning of the 3-year period spending all the money on advertising. Half is I spend half the money in week 1, half the money a year and a half in, and equal says I spread it out over the 3-year period. What's interesting is you can see under model 3, which is again my model, for Snyder's, they should heavy up advertising early on. Why? Well, that's the whole point. By spending money early on, they build their brand equity, their lambda, their carryover is high, and they can monetize that over the 3-year period. So again, this is why firms need to know this, because not only should they change their advertising spend, but they should change the timing of their advertising spend. And again, I want to remind everybody, all of this data, transaction data, pricing data, marketing expenditure data, is freely available. This was data that I didn't have to collect. If I was working for Rolled Gold or Snyder's, this isn't a brand tracker. This is based on the transactional data that they have. Okay? So again, invest in advertising early, monetize later. Okay, so let me wrap up with 2 slides, and then I see I have a couple more questions, which I'll get to. What future work do we have? Well, first of all, what I've shown you a model for is purchasing. But what about purchase timing? So for example, maybe stronger brands are bought more frequently. As a matter of fact, there is some research that shows that stronger brands are actually consumed at a faster rate, which means that people will need to buy them more frequently. So this is what's called, for those of you that like kind of mathematical models, this would be us adding a timing model to the analysis where we look at people's frequency of trips to the store or frequency of trips to a particular product category and see if stronger brands drive you to the product category more frequently. I also haven't talked about purchase volume. So for example, maybe when it's Starbucks, maybe I buy 2 bags of Starbucks coffee, but only 1 bag of the Bradlow coffee. So maybe stronger brands also have what's called a volume effect. So it would be very easy for me to take that intercept, which is in the model I showed you, and just simply add it to a timing model or what's called a volumetric model. The other thing, of course, is this is pretzels. You know, I don't know that there's anybody on this in this webinar that's in the pretzel business. We're actually applying it to all kinds of different product categories. The only thing you need, as I mentioned, is transaction data, marketing expenditure data, and pricing data. You don't need anything else. And there's nothing, matter of fact, this is one of the beautiful things also about analytics, is that it's industry agnostic. There's nothing specific about anything that I've talked about that's specific to consumer packaged goods or fast-moving goods, and certainly not the pretzel category. Okay, so let me summarize. And then I'll leave a minute or 2 for questions, and then I'll move on to the part that I'm equally excited about, which is talking to Martin. Brand equity is, what's the major takeaway? It's not, I like you more, all else equal. I like the all else equal part. I like controlling for stuff, but that doesn't mean all else is equal. Brands' effects are not just on the, let's call intrinsic preference, the intercept. It's on the price coefficient. It's on the coefficient of possibly marketing effectiveness. It's on the perception of quality of the product or service. It has an impact, again, on every facet. Future empirical testing is needed for a broad range of product categories, which we're doing now. In other words, think of this as, you know, Bradlow's built a big hammer, and he's going to hammer it on a bunch of different product categories and see how generalizable this is. Okay? And the last point, and this is something is going to lead perfectly into my discussion with Martin, is that can this replace the need for brand trackers? And the answer is, I don't think so. But the way I like to frame it is that think of a standard survey-based brand tracker. Well, people can say whatever they want. That's what's called stated intention data. I can say, I love this brand, I don't love it, but I'm not paying with my wallet. One of the most intriguing things to me is suppose, and I call this the early warning system, suppose your transaction-based data, transaction-based brand equity, which is what I just presented to you in the last 20 minutes, says one thing, but your stated brand tracker says something entirely different. Now you have a comparison between the two. That's really interesting from a business point of view. As a matter of fact, we could debate for the rest of the day which one's an early warning signal of which. Maybe here's my prediction. If people dislike your brand or your brand equity is declining, people may continue buying it because of state dependence or loyalty, but you'll see your stated brand tracking data go down before you see your transaction data. So to me, these are brother and sister, these are cousins, one shouldn't replace the other. This is really about data fusion. So thank you. Let me just take a few more questions. I'll spend 1 or 2 minutes just taking your questions. But if you have follow-up questions, first of all, you can always tweet at me at @ebradlow. Also, I'm easy to reach at ebradlow@wharton.upenn.edu. Let me just take a few of the questions. Do I distinguish between brand equity and customer equity? Great question. So when I'm thinking about brand equity, which is what I'm talking about here, I'm thinking about brand equity that manifests itself to the customer. In terms of customer equity, I will be talking a lot about customer lifetime value. And let me just take maybe one more question. So these takeaways also apply to personal brand equity. That's a great question. I will say the following. I haven't thought about that question. If you can apply this, if you have transactional data, like if I consider myself my personal brand, and I consider people, let's say, clicking on my web page, or I consider people reaching out to me, or I consider people buying my services, whatever that means, then yeah, you could actually use this to measure how is your personal brand equity doing, as long as you have transaction-based data. So thank you for indulging me to talk about my passion in my research. And I'm sure a lot of the questions that many of you have will come with my discussion now with Martin.